Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow, the paranormal yakker. My guest in today's show is Dennis Stone, owner of America's Stonehenge, a popular New Hampshire tourist attraction. Dennis Stone, welcome to Paranormal Yakker.
Well, thank you, Stan, for having me on today. I'm excited.
How, Dennis, did you get involved with America's Stonehenge?
Well, it goes back to my dad, Robert Stone. He was in 1955, and he was listening to a radio talk show, just like we're doing right now on a Friday evening. It was a big station out of Boston. It was an AM station. And the name of the show was All Yankee Yarns. And Alton Hall Blackington was a talk show host back then. And that evening, they were discussing normal things. We were discussing the site that we call America's Stonehenge tonight. And he had never heard of it. He lived only 7 miles from the site, up in the town of Derry, New Hampshire. And during the course of the show, he just got totally blown away by what they were talking about. He always had a passion for history. He was interested in the Vikings, Native Americans, that kind of thing. And this show with these stone ruins, really, he never heard of such a thing. A few days later, at a barbershop reading a magazine called New Hampshire Profile, he was waiting to have his haircut, opened up the magazine, and there were a couple of different features, and one of them was all about the site with pictures now. He could see what it looked like. And it was one of those coincidences, and it really surprised him. So he asked the barber's name was Warren Haywood, if you could keep the magazine. And the barber goes, well, how old is that? He goes, well, it's 1952. It's been sitting here for 3 years. And if that had happened, it's possible we wouldn't be talking today, because that's the thing that really clinched it for him. He took the magazine home. That weekend at my aunt and uncle's house, about 10 people playing cards on a Saturday evening. And I was about a year old, about a year and a half old at the time. They're playing cards, passed the magazine around, and nobody knew what the site was either until my aunt and uncle, my mom's sister and her brother-in-law, looked at it and said, wait a minute, we were there in the 1930s. We used to bicycle down there on their bikes from Derry, New Hampshire, about 7 or 8 miles down the road, because my dad said, can you find the place? At that point, it was not open to the public. They were doing research on the site, archaeological research, actually beginning in 1937, and it had continued into the 50s. But they drove around North Salem, New Hampshire, trying to find this place, and my aunt and uncle finally saw an old dirt road that looked somewhat familiar, parked the car. They walked about a half a mile into the woods, basically trespassing, and they got on top of this hill, and there was the site. And it was much to the delight and surprise they actually found the place. My dad climbed under the chain link fence. The rest of them stayed outside waiting for him. And when he finally came out after quite a while, my mom, everybody said, what do you think? He goes, well, the place is just simply amazing. And, I'd love to get involved with research, study of this, and maybe open it to the public. And my mom, of course, said something about you got rocks in your head. And he was a full-time AT&T Bell Labs engineer. He stayed at AT&T for 30 years, and he had been in the Coast Guard before that. So it kind of went from him through the family all these years. And we've been open almost 65 years now. My dad passed away in 2009. I'm the second generation. My son, Kelsey, we have only one child. He's 33. He works for Raytheon. He's like my dad. He's an engineer also. And then we have a granddaughter, and she's over there 4 days a week working now. She's 2 years old. So kind of the fourth generation. My career was in the airlines. I spent 35 years flying for the airlines. I ended up with American. I was a captain, and I retired 6 years ago. So it's kind of been a family affair for many, many decades, kind of a love, a passion. And I think we're very, very blessed to have the site, really, to be able to care for it, to maintain it. And in 1971, it became a state of New Hampshire State Historic Site. So it has that designation too.
Over how large an area does the property cover?
Yeah, my dad got involved, the main site and the surrounding 19 acres, so about 20 acres. But what he did is he bought up the entire hill, and the hill is called Mystery Hill today. It never had a name officially until my dad named the place Mystery Hill Caves back in 1958. And in 1963, he dropped the word caves. And then we have the topographical maps. And so the name of the hill is called Mystery Hill, and it's about 110 acres today. He wanted to preserve the entire hilltop. And because in 1963, the highway went into New Hampshire called Route 93. Route 95 from Florida had already, I think, gone through the coast of New Hampshire, and the boom was on for building. So he was kind of fortunate to be able to get the land before it became developed into homes. We need to build homes, obviously, but hopefully not on top of the ruins, and that was his intent, to preserve the entire hilltop. And it is covered with ruins. There's walls, and there's quarried slabs, and there's walls we call serpentine walls we just found in the last 6 years, and they cover the entire hilltop. So it's not just maybe 20 acres, or what we open to the public is about 15 acres today, and then we open the rest of it for snowshoeing in the winter. people can walk over the entire hilltop when there's snow on the ground.
What is the earliest carbon dating that was found on the site?
Yeah, 4,000 years old. That was in 1971. We've done 12 carbon datings. One dating did not test, wasn't enough mass, apparently. We started that process in 1966, and the last carbon dating we did was in 1995. So we did 12 of them, and in the main site again, 1,000. The next one, oldest, was 3,000. Another one came up with a similar date, and then we had various time periods, a little bit newer datings too on the carbon dating.
Who were the original inhabitants?
Well, we know Native Americans go back in New Hampshire over 13,000 years. I was a member of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society, and I still see their publications. And our archaeologist that was retired was with them for 4 decades. And she spent 32 years, 32 years working on the site with us and just retired recently. So Native Americans were here. Who were the builders of the site is still a mystery. You look at the Native Americans first. We've talked to quite a few, though, with the oral tradition, and they don't seem to be the ones that acknowledge building this. It's not really in their oral tradition that they did build this. And today we know of about 800 sites from Quebec and Ontario all the way down towards Virginia. This is one site. There's some sites with just a single chamber across the landscape, and there's other sites like the Hudson Valley with about 500 sites. North Stonington in Connecticut, we found out 6 years ago when a book came out about it. There's 8,000 features. There's stone-built structures, 35,000 acres of land, and there's 25 categories of structures, and they really look just like what we have at our site. That's about 80 miles from here in Connecticut. That blew us away too. My dad knew sites were all over the landscape, but he died in 2009, and here this book came out 7 years later. I think it would have blown him away to see how much there is just in that one town in North Stonington, Connecticut. Same type of features, though, and I have a book in a museum. I show it to the visitors, and they're pretty much awed by the whole thing. Like, wow, how come these things exist and nobody really knows about them, or hears about them, in the media and so forth.
When were the stone chambers on the site built and alignment stones put in place?
Yeah, we think about 4,000 years ago by the 4,000-year-old date. And also, we surveyed the site from 1973 to 1977. We did the astronomical survey, we call it. About 15 acres of walls and standing stones. And that data was fed into the computer at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics down in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The results came back in 1978. They said that if these stone markers were used for that purpose, to align with the sun, the moon, and stars, due to the Earth's tilt, they would work about 1800 BC, plus or minus 200 years. In 1971, we get the 4,000-year-old date, and here we are 7 years later getting an astronomical date very close to the same time period of about 4,000 years. So I think that's when construction took place. We're starting to think, though, it was a layering of cultures, and it may have been generational, and they may have been modified in site during time. It wasn't just all built at once, is what our feeling is today.
Were any bones or artifacts ever found on the site? And if they were, could you tell me about them?
Bones in New England usually dissolve in a few hundred years due to the acidity in the soil, and animals like to eat bones for minerals and stuff. But yes, we have found bones. There's a chamber called the Watch House, and several bones came out of that. The Watch House is outside what we call the main site, which is about a 1-acre area. There are satellite chambers outside that area. The focus in the early days was that 1-acre area, and a few bones were found in that too back in 1938 by the original researcher, Mr. Goodwin. And those bones in 1968 were taken to the Smithsonian by a woman. I'm trying to think of her name right now, but 1968, she was a school teacher. She brought them to the Smithsonian with bones from the Watch House that I mentioned. The bones in the Watch House were identified as possibly bison. And the woman that looked at them was Dr. Lucy Huygen. She was a physical anthropologist. She showed them to her male colleagues, the bones that were the bison ones, and she said, well, do they look like bison? And he looked at them carefully, examined them, did a study, and he said, yes, they do. And she goes, well, they're from New Hampshire. And he goes, well, yeah, there were bison up in New Hampshire, the woodland buffalo, because that was kind of a surprise to a lot of us. We had buffalo, but I guess we shouldn't be too surprised. But the ones in the main site she looked at, and she was kind of puzzled by these because she said they're human, and they had markings on them while the human was alive, like something happened on the bones. And there were 3 of them. And she said the other thing about them is they're very, very dense material, denser than she would expect for a human bone. We couldn't carbon date them at that point because Mr. Goodwin took them out of the ground in the 1930s. Carbon dating didn't exist until about 1950. So they were exposed to the elements for 30 years. And if you do that, you basically contaminate the bones. You can't carbon date them. But what we're thinking of today, we still have the bones. They're in our museum on display. People can see them every day. Is maybe DNA testing and see what they are. If they are human, and then maybe we can identify the type of human they were. And her concerns were that the bones were quite dense. They shouldn't have been like that. But she said, my feeling is these are human bones. So we have had a few bones. But again, I think most of them decay within a few hundred years. So we're lucky to even have these.
Could you, Dennis, tell me something about the oracle chamber, speaking table, and sacrificial table?
The table itself is about a 9,000 compound stone. It's kind of bell-shaped, if you would. It has a large cutout on the surface. It's a grooved surface. Actually, we thought it was a rectangular groove on the top surface, but it actually is trapezoid. It's about 9 inches narrower at the top than it is at the bottom. And on one side, towards the bottom of the bell, if you will, on the flat side of the bell, if you looked at it looks just like a bell, is a runnel. And the runnel goes off the table and it goes down a couple of feet to the bedrock. And the bedrock has been notched out to collect perhaps some fluid that might be on the table. The table sits on 4 legs. Mr. Goodwin thought it was sitting on the ground, and when he excavated, the legs appeared, and it was much to the surprise it was set up like a table, although 9,000 pounds. And on the east side of the table, on the top of the bell, if you will, that's where the oracle chamber is. And the oracle chamber is the biggest chamber still at the site. It runs north, south, like most of the structures, out of true north and east and west. And it's a very large chamber. It's a beautiful chamber, and it's mostly intact, except the entrance has the roof slabs missing today. They were taken out by the town fathers in the early 20s to keep kids from playing there. So they took the roof slabs, the lintel, put it into the entrance, and they didn't want kids going into it. There was a cracked roof slab inside. They were afraid kids would get injured if the roof slab fell in. But inside that chamber, as you're walking along, heading kind of north, on your left side, there's a tube. It's about 6 feet long. It runs horizontally from the oracle chamber to underneath the sacrificial table. And when Mr. Goodwin was first cleaning it with his crew, one of them moved a stone, and a stone came out of the wall like a plug, and there's that hole there, 6-foot hole, kind of rectangular shape. And they went around to the other side and they found another stone plug and pulled that out. And we have what we call the oracle tube today. And that's why we call it the oracle chamber. It suggested that somebody would stand inside the chamber, and right below the tube, the bedrock was removed except for a piece right below it. And so it's like a step. It's part of the bedrock today. And somebody around 5.5 feet tall, maybe a little bit taller, about 5'8", you can stand on that, and your head will be the right position to yell through the tube. The voice comes out underneath the table. On the west side of the table, there's a ramp. It's a stone-built ramp that's up higher. It's a place where even our visitors today come up. They stand there and look down at the table. Thought is maybe during a ceremony, maybe on a solstice or equinox or some special occasion, people might be up there celebrating and using it as a ceremonial table. Was it sacrificial? We don't know. And that's something we may never know, but there's a thing called protein analysis. If it was a sacrificial table and blood get into one of the microfishes, one of the little cracks, it's possible to extract that. And then you can actually tell if it's animal or human, and you go back about 11,000 years. I just had a doctor of archaeology from the University of Connecticut come up. He's working on another site similar to it in Connecticut. State of Connecticut just purchased the 250-acre site. It's just west of North Stonington, Connecticut, where I mentioned those other chambers are. He talked about protein analysis. He said, well, it's possible we could use it here. However, because the top surface has been exposed to the sunlight in the environment for so long, maybe since the table was set up thousands of years ago, that it might not work on that. But that's a possibility. They use it on arrowheads, they use it on other stone implements where there's micro cracks, and they extract the material and they say, oh yeah, there was blood on here at one time and it was from this animal or person, whatever. So the table is really interesting. I think it's an altar, and I think it's a ceremonial site. It's 360 feet above sea level, about 40 miles north of Boston, 20 miles from the ocean. And just to the south is the Merrimack River, one of the largest rivers in New England. A tributary goes right to the bottom of our hill called the Spigot River. Kind of puts it kind of in perspective of where we are. We are in southern New Hampshire. And again, it's one of about 800 sites. And right around us in the town of Windham, Blastow, Raymond, and a couple other towns are these chambers too. So it's not really all by itself. But the other chambers are kind of one chamber, then you drive down the road 5 miles and see another chamber kind of thing. Ours is like the Reader's Digest, everything compressed on about 110 acres.
What is the significance of the astronomical alignments on the site?
Yeah, that work began in 1965. They were looking at these stones out in the woods. Some of the property, like when Mr. Goodwin had the 20 acres, some of the stone markers he was aware of out beyond the main site was in the deep woods. He didn't own part of the land either where some of the markers were set up. We began clearing the trees on an alignment called the Winter Solstice Sunset back in 1965. We had to wait 2 years till we completed that, and that the weather cooperated in 1967. The sun actually behind some cirrus clouds sat on the stone. But you have to have 2 points to make an alignment, like a foresight and a back sight, kind of like a gun sight. So they thought the center of the site might be the sacrificial table initially. But what we found as we began more research in the late 60s and into the early 70s and started surveying the site, that the astronomical center was just north of the sacrificial table. And there were 2 points. And under these 2 points were piles of rocks we call cairns. Mr. Goodwin photographed them, they diagrammed them, they talked about them, and they looked like beehive chambers on the outside, and he thought they might be hollow on the inside. And when they started looking at them closely, they were solid 2 stone piles almost side by side. And after that, during his restoration, rebuilding some of the structures, and we have all the photographic records going back to 1900. We have 4 from 1920. If people ask what did Goodwin do, but he also, his right hand man was a professional photographer, Malcolm Pearson. He's a gentleman my dad ended up buying the site from. But Malcolm photographed it. He was a professional photographer. We have his glass slides, plastic slides. We have his prints, and we have aerial shots. He only died about 11 years ago at about 100 years old. So we have all this photographic. We have newspaper clippings from 1935 before Goodwin ever came. Those platforms are there, but unfortunately he took them apart, and we have a couple of pictures we just got recently. We found them in Malcolm's collection of a hand winch, and it's different angles with a hand winch. There's like a tripod set up with a hand winch, and they're lifting up all the rocks off these platforms, rebuilding part of the ramp they mentioned earlier. And unfortunately, 40 years later, we realized that they were the astronomical centers of the site, and Goodwin basically, unfortunately, destroyed them. But the photographic record and the diagrams are still there. And Goodwin wrote 4 books, and one of the books has some of the diagrams of those flags. So the astronomical center, we have about 57 alignments with the sun, moon, and stars. And in 1978, when we got the report back from Harvard, we were quite surprised that they said you have 24 star alignments. We had only looked at one alignment, and that was Polaris today, that aligns with the true north-south axis of the Earth. And we knew that Thuban and Alpha Draconis, the dragon or the serpent constellation, was the pole star over 4,000 years ago. We didn't realize we had 23 other star alignments. And actually, 20 years ago, Dr. Winkler from Penn State, he was an archaeoastronomer for 35 years. And in the late 90s, he started coming to our site around 97. And I think in around 1999 to 2000, he retired from Penn State. And unfortunately, as he really started getting into our site and looking at the star alignments, he did put out a 30-page report on it, but he wasn't complete. It was not complete. He wasn't done with it. He had a massive heart attack and passed away. And that's where we kind of left it today with the astronomical work. However, in 2016, I started finding serpentine walls all over the landscape. And today we think we have 14 serpent walls, anywhere from 27 feet up to 2,550 feet. And these walls have a head, a body, and a tail. And I had no idea what they were at first. I said, I think it's a serpent, but I have no frame of reference. And in 2017, we went to an archaeological meeting in Groton, Connecticut, not too far from North Stonington. And that's where the Gunjiwam site is, actually. We were at a hotel. They had a nice meeting. It was the New England Antiquities Research Association. And they had a gentleman from North Stonington. He wrote a book called Ceremonial Stonework. So Mark Starr, actually, he was living there for 30 years, and he wrote the book Ceremonial Stonework. And in this book, as I picked it up before he spoke, I saw on the back cover 8,000 structures, as I mentioned, 25 categories. And as I flipped through it, I'm starting to see these walls that look like a snake. And I'm like, wow, that's what we have. And today they think they have 400 serpent walls just in that one town of North Stonington, from about 80 feet. I guess actually from 30 feet up to 300 feet, the average is about 80 feet. They're linear, rectilinear, curvilinear, and some come around and bite the tail, like the Ouroboros, which is a symbol of life by the Egyptians, and I think Greeks and other cultures, or the symbol of eternity. And we have one today that wraps around the entire 15 acres where the astronomical alignments are, and it touches every astronomical foresight. And that starts at the watch house. I mentioned the watch house before. We think that's the head of the serpent. It undulates behind, it wraps around, touches every astronomical alignment. And one of the humps is part of one of the alignments, as a matter of fact, on the west side. It comes right in front of its face. The tail comes right in front of its face with just one more hump and a 90-degree twist. I don't know if you have those images, but it's pretty amazing when you look at it. It looks just like a serpent head biting its tail, the Ouroboros. We're finding these serpent walls across the nation. They go in Colorado. A lady spoke after this gentleman did, and she's showing the same kind of wall work we have in New England. And at our site in North Stonington, she shows her serpent walls, and one of them looked like a twin to one of ours. My wife and I poked each other. She did it by Skype from Colorado, Denver. So unfortunately, I couldn't talk to her in person, but she did it in front of the whole audience. So it's really exciting. I'm like, wow, they got that 2,000 miles away. And they're in Alabama. They call them rattlesnake walls, or in Kentucky. And where Mark Eddy lives, there's serpent walls down there too. They go all the way out to California by Mount Shasta, in a place called Weed, California. We got 110 pictures from there, and they got similar wall patterns, but some of the wall patterns are serpentine in shape like ours. So it goes across the nation, right down into Alabama, and we keep finding more and more of these walls. Some people think that Draco, the constellation I mentioned before, might have been inspirational in people building these. Plus, we also have snakes too on the ground. We just saw some last week. We had a tour with Scott Walters, and for some reason, we were out looking at a stone they call the Goddess Stone, and there was like 3 or 4 snakes around people's feet. It was like a movie, and people is getting a little panicky, but they're just goddess snakes. Very appropriate though, because you're standing very close to one of the serpent walls at the same time. That's one of the new finds we have, are the serpentine wall in the last 6 years.
Regarding the serpentine walls, which you just spoke about, and the spirit windows, were they part of the original complex, or were they added at a later date?
That's a perfect question, Stan. We don't know at this time if the structures and the serpentine walls were built at the same time. Some people have different feelings about that maybe like the serpent walls were earlier and the chambers are later. So what we need to do is get some testing, and we have been doing optically stimulated luminescence testing. This it started 2 years ago, and we're just getting results out now. And they did sites again from ours all the way down to Virginia. Dr. Feathers from the University of Washington is conducting that. It used to take 5 years to get the results, so down to a little over 2 years. He did 12 places so far have been complete. The results are going into the journal called the Quaternary Geochronological Journal. And the editors in Germany, they have 33 editors around the world that do peer review on the science. And the magazine basically is about dating techniques and different dating processes that are used. And this type of optically stimulated luminescence, I think, started with the University of Oxford in the 1980s, but it's being used more and more today. You don't need charcoal. You don't need any organic material that was living like shell or bone or roots or anything like that we've used in our carbon datings, but just need dirt. The dirt has to have potassium, feldspar, or quartz or calcite in it. It's an interesting process, but the dates so far that he put out on our site, it did 4 cores, 2 were rock samples, and they had difficulty at getting any information from the rock samples, but the sediment samples, the serpent tail in front of it dated to 1400 AD. To me, it doesn't say that the wall was built there. It just said the wall was there and the dirt built up around it. And that dirt, basically, it's like a dark house environment. They have to collect the samples. If any light strikes the sample, it contaminates it. So they have to take and get the cores, and then they have to protect it from sunlight, and then they send it out to the laboratory at the University of Washington. My thing is every structure, feature, and wall, and even monolith on the property is sitting on bedrock, and then the dirt came in after. So, like, I believe that's a minimum date. And the other sample of dirt was from the top of the oracle chamber, and that date was around 1550 AD, how that'll end up. But basically, Dr. Feathers says, so the chamber was there, and the dirt came in after. Many of the mainstream thought our site, many others were built by farmers in the last 200 or 300 years. So this date puts it back before the colonial period in New England. Then the question is who built the site. But I think the carbon datings, the 12 carbon datings, put the site back to an earlier period. It's just supported by the OSL dates. It's just like you build a chamber, the dirt comes in later, and then you date dirt when it saw the light of day last. You get a date. It's a minimum. It doesn't say when the site was necessarily constructed, but that's when the dirt came in. Structures first, the dirt comes in later. Like on the roof, you can't build a chamber underneath the ground. I mean, you can hollow out the ground, I guess, but that's not the way these structures were built. They were kind of like the Fred Flintstone structures, dry stone construction, and they put big, huge roof slabs on top of the chambers. The biggest one on the main site is 14 tons, about 28,000 pounds stone. They lifted and put it right on top of one of the structures. And that's pretty typical of what they did all over the main site with the chambers. Well, we are doing those datings, and if we could do the wall, more of the walls out there, the serpentine walls, maybe we'll have a better idea, Stan, of their time period. The more samples you do, the more accuracy I think you get. It is $1,000 per sample. They did 4 samples at our site. They did 44 from here to Virginia. They have to raise funds for that kind of thing. You have to pay for that.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to learn more about America's Stonehenge and receive information on visiting it, how can they do that?
If you go to our website, stonehengeusa.com, there's a phone number in there. We have an email address in there. We also have a 12-minute video that we show in our theater to our visitors. You can watch our video at home. There's also a free app downloaded. Download the app. It will take you on a complete tour of the site without even coming. You can do it in your lazy boy home. It takes you structure by structure. It has picture, text, and sound. And so as you're sitting there, you can do a complete tour. If you use that app at our site, as you're walking, it will do the same thing. You know, it'll take you on a complete tour around our site, which is kind of nice. So stonehengeusa.com, and you can find all that information in there. And again, we're open every day except for the occasional northeaster we get in the wintertime. But we do snowshoeing in our site. And then, as I mentioned, I think earlier, and people can walk all over the hill, and we have a special snowshoe trail map. And in the winter, it's kind of cool because you can see a lot as long as there's not too much snow. You can see the chambers and stuff on the walls, the serpentine walls, the glacial cliff shelter where some pottery came from that dated to about 2,500 years old. It's Middle Woodland period pottery. So it's probably a summer glacial cliff shelter for Native Americans overlooking the Spigot River. So you can walk below that too. It looks like a little mini Mesa Verde, if you will.
Dennis Stone, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker and for sharing your extensive knowledge of America's Stonehenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stan. I really enjoyed it, and hope maybe sometime you come up and visit us. Thank you again. I really appreciated it.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of my interview with Dennis Stone, owner of America's Stonehenge. In part 2, I'll be talking with him about research currently going on at the site, the findings of paranormal investigators, investigators who explored the area, the similarities and differences with Stonehenge in England, and the role America's Stonehenge played in an episode of Ancient Aliens that was about UFOs over the Hudson Valley and New England. So that you don't miss it, have access to past interviews, and be amongst the first to receive new interviews when released, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.